Well, good morning, everybody. What a beautiful day it is. I had the privilege of having Sabbath school outside under the trees this morning. If any of you would like to come and join our Sabbath school class, young adults and young at heart, you're more than most welcome to join us. Am I on, Richard? Can you all hear me? Going? Here we go. That's better. Oops, not that one. If I can have my first slide, that'd be great. So I'm going to ask you, what's the title of my sermon this morning, just from that picture?
Swimming against the tide.
Pretty much, against the flow. Against the flow. This is a New Zealand man by the name of Arthur Allen Thomas. Some of you may never have heard of Arthur. In 1970, he was convicted of the shooting murders of his next-door neighbours. He was a dairy farmer in the Waikato Valley in the North Island of New Zealand, and he was accused of and convicted and sentenced and jailed for shooting Harvey and Jeanette Crew, his neighbouring farmers. And for a long time, the police could not pin some evidence on him to convict him of this murder, even though he had legitimate alibis for not being at the scene of the crime. So they grabbed his gun, his .22 caliber rifle. They seconded his gun, took it to the rifle range and fired some shells out of it, collected the shells out of his gun, then took the shells and planted them in the flower bed outside the window of Harvey and Jeanette's house where the alleged shootings had taken place from. So on the basis of that fabricated evidence, Arthur Allen Thomas spent 9 years of his life in jail. I remember this vividly as a child, growing up in the 1970s. His case was in the news time and time again. He went through various courts of appeal. There was a couple of retrials. There was finally a royal commission. And you've got to have a fair weight of evidence on someone's side to get the government to agree to a royal commission. And in the royal commission, all this evidence of the police fabrication of the details of his case came to light. Arthur Allen Thomas was pardoned for that crime and awarded at the time, when I was just a kid in 1979, awarded at the time $950,000, which is close to $1 million, and we all went, wow, what would you do with $1 million? But $1 million never brought this man's life back. His marriage did not survive the strain of him being imprisoned for 9 years. And when he came out of jail, he took his compensation and he moved to Australia to try and rebuild his shattered life. And somewhat similar to the Australian case of Lindy Chamberlain, which many of you will be familiar with, this was New Zealand's equivalent to the Chamberlain case. Arthur Allen Thomas wrongly convicted, fabricated evidence, and spent time in his life incarcerated for that. Lindy only spent 3 years in jail, but her life and her marriage to Michael never survived the public scrutiny that took place. As human beings, we have an innate sense of justice within us. What's the word I'm looking for? Innate, sorry, not inept, innate sense of justice within us. Whether we perceive the injustice against ourselves or against somebody else. If we see someone innocent, suffering for whatever reason, because of their innocence, because they are accused of something they did not do, our innate sense of justice wells up within us. No matter how bad or good we are, we still seem to have within us a sense of right and wrong. Well, we've been doing a series on the lives of different people who personally encountered Jesus. And we started way back Just before Christmas, if you remember last year, we started with the announcement of his birth, and we have progressed through Jesus' life as recorded in the Gospels and specific individuals who encountered him one-on-one. And this morning, I want to look at the life of a man whom we know as Pontius Pilate. Because Pontius Pilate only had a very short but intense encounter with Jesus, but it was a life-changing encounter. And this is an example, unfortunately, of a life-changing encounter that didn't change for the better. So who was Pontius Pilate? Well, we know he was the 5th Roman prefect or governor of Judea. Romans had been reigning in that part of the world, in Palestine, since 63 BC. And Pontius came to his job in 26 AD. So just a year before Christ was baptised in 27 AD, Pontius Pilate came to his role as governor of Judea. We don't know a great deal about his background. There's some speculation that he may have come from Spanish aristocracy. There are others that say that he was definitely of Italian descent. But he also had some connections with the imperial family. Some people say that his wife was an illegitimate granddaughter of Caesar Augustus. Whatever his connections were, he found himself looking after an area of the Roman Empire that really no one else wanted that job. It was sort of the last straw. If you got a posting to Judea, it was like, you had drawn the emperor's disfavour. When he arrived in Judea, he lived, as the Roman governors did, in the seaside port of Caesarea. This was an artificial harbour that Herod the Great had built and eventually became the centre of commerce on that strip of coast on the Mediterranean Sea there. And it became the established base for the Roman occupiers, became their centre of governance. This is a stone that was found in 1961. It was excavated in 1961 at some ruins there at Caesarea. And on it is the only inscription we have from that time where it actually has Pilate's name written on it. And I know you're probably struggling to see that, but I'll show you what an artist's reconstruction of it would have looked like based on the letters that are still there. It would have said Caesarea Tiberium Pontius Pilates Prefectus Judea dedicated. In other words, it was a plaque that Pilate, as governor of Judea, had dedicated to Tiberius Caesar. And the original is in the Jerusalem Museum today, and there's a copy of it down there in Caesarea. That is the seaside port of Caesarea, where his palace would have been as the governor today. And that's an artist's reconstruction of what it might have looked like in his time when he was governor there. Caesarea, of course, is some 60 kilometres away from, or was it 60 miles? Can't remember. Away from Jerusalem. So Caesarea is up there on the coast, and Jerusalem is down here. And it was an overland journey up through the mountains to get to Jerusalem, or you could come down the coast and back up through that way. When Pontius first came to Judea, what sort of guy was he? Well, let's just ask the question, what sort of guy was he? Well, we have two historical descriptions of him from Jewish historians, Philo and Josephus, and they both say he was a very vindictive, cruel, angry man. Not the sort of guy that you want to have in a position of power, but perhaps if you're reigning over a portion of the Roman Empire that's given to rebellion and insurrection, he's the sort of guy you want to have on the job. A very cruel, vindictive man. And when he first arrived in Judea, one of the first things he did was he went up to Jerusalem with his Roman escort, soldiers, cavalry, whatever. They went to a place in Jerusalem right next door to the temple. and it was called the Antonia Fortress. This is it here. This is a building that the Romans had stuck on the side of the Temple Mount, like a pimple on the side, if you like, and a pimple on the side of the life of Jewish pride and nationalism. They despised the fact that the Romans had built a fortress that overlooked their sacred temple. But it was on this fortress that Pontius Pilate, the first night, and he did it at night time, the first night he arrived there, he unfurled the imperial insignia out of the banners, out of the windows of that fortress, right in full view of the Temple Mount. Now, the insignia of the Roman Empire had lots of different pagan symbols on it, animals and gods that they worshipped, the eagle, of course, being the main one. To the Jewish people, this was the highest insult that their Roman occupiers could do to them, to put what they considered an image or an idol over and above their temple. Well, Pontius didn't hang around to find out the Jewish reaction. He hightailed it out of town down to Caesarea. The Jewish reaction was such that there was several days of rioting in the city, and they sent a delegation of no less than 7,000 Jews down to Caesarea to camp outside of his palace in Caesarea and demand that he remove those royal insignia. Well, at first he refused. And what he'd done is he'd got his bodyguard soldiers to surround these Jewish protesters, and he said, I'm going to come and speak to them. When I give the command, I want you to go in and slaughter them. Well, he went out to talk to them, and they said, we want you to take down those insignia. And he basically said to them, unless you bow to my authority, I'll have the lot of you slaughtered. Well, to a man, they bared their necks, knelt down on the ground and said, well, you might as well do it now, because we're not going to put up with this. At that moment, Pontius Pilate backed down and agreed to remove the banners. What sort of man was Pontius Pilate? He was afraid that news of this would get back to the imperial court in Rome. You'll notice, I just want to show you this while we're here, while I've got the slide up. Over in the background here, this is a scale model. You can go to Jerusalem today, see the scale model. It's a 1:50 scale model of what the city of Jerusalem would have looked like in the first century. In that back corner is actually Herod Antipas's palace. This was the palace that Herod the Great built for himself. And it was to this, some bad photography on my part, I didn't cut the heads off. It was to this palace that later on in our story you're going to find Jesus is taken to during the night of his trial. But Pilate is probably best remembered throughout history for the one day of his life that he probably wished had never happened. For the one prisoner that was brought before him that he wished he never had to adjudicate over. And that, of course, was Jesus of Nazareth. And our story today is going to take a close focus on the events that unfolded on that fateful Friday. But how did Pilate find himself in this situation? I want to just share with you another little passage in Scripture that shows us a little bit about this guy. Just to give you a glimpse, we get a window on what he was like in Luke's Gospel. Luke records an historical incident that is unverified outside of Scripture. So we have no other historical reference to it. It's not something that Josephus mentions. It's not something that Philo mentions. It's not mentioned in any other Roman historical documents. But in Luke chapter 13 and verse 1, we read that Jesus is commenting on a current event that had taken place in his lifetime right in Jerusalem. And we read there that there were some present as Jesus was speaking. There were some present at that time who told Jesus about the Galileans whose blood Pilate had mixed with their sacrifices. Now, we know that Pilate came as governor in AD 26. We know that Jesus was baptised in AD 27. And this was probably sort of well into his ministry, his three and a half years of ministry. So somewhere in that time, in that short period that Pilate had been governor, he had gone up to Jerusalem and he had confronted a group of Galileans. Now, there was a guy in Galilee at the time during his reign known as Judas the Galilean. And Judas had set himself up as a bit of a Messiah and had led a group of Galilean people away from paying taxes to Rome. He said, any Jewish person that gives any money to this idolatrous government is accursed of God. And so he had this group of following, if you like, group of people around him that had started withholding their taxes. And it's possible that this group of people had gone up to the temple to offer their sacrifices, and Pilate had taken the opportunity to make a public example of anyone who defied Roman power. We don't know any other details about this, where it took place, what happened, or just exactly what transpired. But if the Roman soldiers had gone into the Temple Mount area to attack these Galileans, you could only begin to imagine the tumult that would have created in the city. So that's the sort of guy that Pilate is. Most of the time, he spent his governorship down in Caesarea, but he would go up to Jerusalem at times that were significant in the calendar year of the Jewish nation. And of course, the Passover year being the Passover season, festival being that time, Jews came from all around the country, even from overseas. The population in Jerusalem probably quadrupled in that time. And to make sure there was no unrest, he would have his own physical presence there with his armed forces, if necessary, to put down any rebellion towards the Roman government. So here we find Pontius Pilate on that day, that Friday morning, that early Friday morning. I want to take you now to John's Gospel, John chapter 18. And if you want to follow along with me, I want to read some of the story to you. John chapter 18 and verse 28. Jesus, of course, had been the subject of a huge miscarriage of justice overnight before the hastily assembled Jewish council, the Sanhedrin. And that's the subject of another sermon we could look at another time. Subject to say, twice tried by his own people without a successful conclusion on their part, they then took him to the Roman governor in a hope of securing the death decree. And the miscarriage of justice that had taken place already that night was about to get worse from here on in. Then the Jews led Jesus from Caiaphas, to the high priest, to the palace of the Roman governor. By now it was early morning, and to avoid ceremonial uncleanness, the Jews did not enter the palace. They wanted to be able to eat the Passover. So Pilate came out to them and asked, "What charges are you bringing against this man?" "If he were not a criminal," they replied, "we would not have handed him over to you." Pilate said, "Take him yourselves and judge him by your own law." "But we have no right to execute anyone," the Jews objected. This happened so that the words Jesus had spoken, indicating the kind of death he was going to die, would be fulfilled. Pilate then went back inside the palace and summoned Jesus and asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" "Is that your own idea?" Jesus asked, "or did others talk to you about me?" "Am I a Jew?" Pilate replied. "It was your people and your chief priests who handed you over to me. What is it you have done?" Jesus said, "My kingdom is not of this world. If it were, my servants would fight to prevent my arrest by the Jews, but now my kingdom is from another place." "You are a king then," said Pilate. Jesus answered, "You are right in saying I am a king. In fact, for this reason I was born, and for this reason I came into the world, to testify to the truth. Everyone on the side of truth listens to me." "What is truth?" Pilate asked. And with this he went out again to the Jews and said, "I find no basis for a charge against him, but it's your custom for me to release to you one of the prisoners at the time of the Passover. Do you want me to release to you the king of the Jews?" Pilate had standing before him, despite his limited exposure to Jewish culture, Jewish religion, and just who Jesus was. Perhaps he had heard the rumours about this miracle worker. Perhaps those stories had filtered down to him, even though he didn't move in those circles. But he had standing before him that morning truth personified. Understand what I mean by that? He had standing before him truth personified. If he wanted to know what truth was, it was there right before his eyes. John begins his gospel by saying that Jesus came from the Father full of grace and truth. If Pilate wanted to know what truth was, it was standing there that morning. And the truth was, an innocent man was about to lay down his life for the souls of men and women in this entire planet. Not that Pilate understood any of that. This is an interesting conversation. This is the longest single dialogue that Jesus has with one individual on that day. Pilate is given, if you like, his own private audience with Jesus. Jesus didn't even exchange this many words with the high priest at his trial. But he gave Pilate the benefit of his time to explain to him who he was, so that Pilate could be without excuse. Pilate was not left in the dark as to who this man was standing before him. But then something happens. I want to take you to Luke's gospel now, because like a scene of at a crossroads of an intersection where an accident takes place and four people are standing on four different corners of that intersection and they see that accident from four different angles, Luke gives us some information, as each of the four gospel writers do. We can put it together to get the entire picture. I want to take you now to Luke chapter 23, just briefly. Luke 23 and verse 5 to 11. I'll pick it up in verse 4. Pilate announced to the chief priests and the crowd, "I find no basis of charge against this man." But they insisted. "He stirs up all the people all over Judea by his teaching. He started in Galilee and has come all the way here." On hearing this, in other words, Pilate's ears pricked up. On hearing this, he asked if the man was a Galilean. And when he learned that Jesus was under Herod's jurisdiction, he sent him to Herod, who was in Jerusalem at that time. That's why I showed you on the map previously, a few moments ago, where Herod's palace was in relation to the Antonia fortress, where Pilate probably was. This was Pilate's, ring a friend. This was, I can get out of this. I can have this situation disappear by transferring the case to another jurisdiction. I'll send him over to the Court of Appeals. I don't have to deal with this. I can wash my hands of this situation now by transferring the prisoner to someone else's jurisdiction. Pilate hoped to escape the conviction that was upon him, that it was within his power to release an innocent man that morning. He passes the proverbial buck to someone else. But it backfires on him, because from the story we can read on, Herod plies Jesus with questions, hoping that Jesus will also perform a miracle, and Jesus is dead silent. He doesn't say a thing. All that he needs to say has already been said. He doesn't need to entertain Herod for his own pleasure. Herod tires of this and sends him back. And now this is Pilate's worst nightmare, because what he'd hoped would go away has come back to face him. In our own lives, often we pass the buck. We avoid something because we just hope it will go away. But have you, like me, experienced that God will bring you back time and time again to face the thing that you're hoping to avoid? Have you experienced that in your life? Happens a lot in mine. The things I try and avoid, God will constantly bring me back to face those things again. And Pilate is again faced with dealing with Jesus. Verse 13 of Luke 23 says, Pilate called together the chief priests and rulers of the people and said to them, "You brought me this man as one inciting the people to rebellion. I have examined him in your presence and have found no basis for your charges against him. Neither has Herod, for he sent me back to us. And as you can see, he's done nothing to deserve death. Therefore," what should he have said next? One word. One Latin word, absolvo. The case is absolved, finished. Judgment has been passed, this man is innocent, the case is closed. But he didn't. Because he had a spine as weak as water. And so he said, "Therefore, I will punish him, and then I'll have him released." He thought, ding, he had a light bulb moment where he thought, I can get out of this. I'll have him flogged. Then that'll be enough to satisfy the crowd and I can have my day back to myself. Unfortunately, from there on, things were only going to go downhill, spiral downhill for Pilate. So, I want you to come with me now to Matthew. I want to get Matthew's perspective on it now, because we're standing on another street corner as we look at this scene. Matthew 27 and verse 15. This is where Pilate starts to play a game that's going to backfire on him. Matthew 27 and verse 15. Now, it was the governor's custom. Whose custom? So it was his prerogative. The governor's custom at the feast to release a prisoner chosen by the crowd. The Romans didn't keep people in jail for the fun of it. It wasn't like you got a 5-year sentence or a 10-year sentence. You were in a Roman jail, you were on death row. Yet it was their custom to release a prisoner chosen by the crowd. Does that sound like justice? Is that justice? If you're on death row for a crime committed and you're released just because of popular opinion, is that justice? Of course it's not. It's a miscarriage of justice, isn't it? The punishment should fit the crime. At that time, they had a notorious prisoner called Barabbas. So when the crowd had gathered, Pilate asked them, "Which one do you want me to release to you? Barabbas or Jesus, who is called Christ?" For he knew, what did he know? He knew it was out of envy that they had handed him over to him. He knew what their motive was for bringing this innocent man before him that morning. He knew they wanted to get rid of him because he was a problem to them and their society and their culture and their religion. What did we learn last week? How did the high priest sum up Jesus' ministry? Look how this is getting us nowhere. The whole world is going after him. And Caiaphas pronounced those prophetic words. You don't know. It's better for one man to perish one man to die than the whole nation perish. Perhaps even that had filtered down to Pilate. He knew it was out of envy they'd handed me over. And this is where it gets really, really interesting. Who was Barabbas? A thief and a murderer. He had taken place in a riot in the city, probably one of those occasions when the Sicarii or the assassins had decided to take on some of the Roman forces there. He had taken part in a riot and he had murdered someone. He may have even murdered someone whom he considered one of his own countrymen who had compromised with the Roman authorities. What's that word we use? Collaborated. Perhaps he had murdered one of his own countrymen who had collaborated with the Roman authorities. He was also a thief. Whose son was he? What does his name mean? Bar-Abbas, son of the Father. His name means Son of the Father. Who was his father? If he was a thief and a murderer, who was his father? How did Jesus describe the prince of this world? As a thief and a murderer. Jesus described Satan as a thief and a murderer. He spoke to you read it in John chapter 8, verse 44. He spoke to the people of his day and said, "You're following your father. He's a liar and a murderer from the beginning." Barabbas is the son of Satan and his kingdom. Who does Jesus represent? You couldn't get a bigger contrast, could you? Right about now, things are going to go really south for Pilate. But God never places us in a position without giving us an opportunity to stand up for what is right, without giving us an opportunity to place our trust in his providential care. And the very next verse tells us in Matthew's Gospel that while Pilate was sitting on the judge's seat, his wife sent him a message. Don't have anything to do with who? That innocent man. Don't have anything to do with that innocent man, for I have suffered a great deal in a dream today because of him. Scripture tells us that God never brings any temptation our way that he doesn't provide a way out for us. This was Pilate's out. His wife through his wife had sent him his own personal hand-delivered message. If Pilate was facilitating just then as to what he was going to do, miraculously, God sent him a handwritten note. Don't have anything to do with that innocent man. You couldn't have got a more clearer, what's the word I'm looking for? Injunction in the case right now. God himself sent him a personal message. Wow. Well, that could have been his out. But by now, the crowd was getting out of control. Let's see what happens next. Verse 20. But the chief priests and the elders persuaded the crowd to ask for Barabbas and to have Jesus executed. "Which of the two do you want me to release to you?" asked Pilate. "Barabbas," they answered. "What shall I do then with Jesus who is called Christ or Messiah?" Pilate asked. And they all answered, "Crucify him." "Why? What crime has he committed?" But they all shouted louder, "Crucify him!" When Pilate saw that he was getting nowhere, but that instead an uproar had started, he took water and washed his hands in front of the crowd. Just before this, something else took place. This is where you need to blend the four gospel records together. If you come back to John chapter 19 begins with these words. Before it had come to this, John chapter 19 tells us that Pilate took Jesus and had him flogged. The soldiers twisted together a crown of thorns and put it on his head. They clothed him with purple robe and went up to him again and again, saying, "Hail, King of the Jews!" And they struck him in the face. And once more Pilate came out to the Jews and said, "Look, I am bringing him out so that you will know I find no basis for a charge against him." Was there any doubt as to this man's innocence? None whatsoever. When Jesus came out wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe, Pilate said, "Here is the man." But he had just flogged him. Was that a miscarriage of justice? Absolutely. And I haven't got the time to go into the details of a Roman flogging, but let's just say there wouldn't have been much flesh left on Jesus' back. An innocent man. Pilate thought he could placate the crowd by having Jesus flogged, but he was dealing with someone who was innocent of any crime. The greatest crime that morning was a man who could not see that before him stood the life of an innocent man, and it was his job to protect the life of an innocent man. And so he comes back, brings him back. Here is the man. As soon as the chief priests and the officials saw him, they shouted, "Crucify, crucify!" But Pilate answered, "You take him and crucify him, for I find no basis of a charge against him." And notice these words. The Jews insisted, "We have a law." Mind, they have laws. They had laws for everything. "We have a law, and according to that law, he must die because he claimed to be the Son of God." This was Pilate's last chance. When Pilate heard this, he was even more afraid, and he went back inside the palace and called Jesus in. "Where do you come from?" he asked Jesus. But this time, Jesus was silent. "Do you refuse to speak to me?" Pilate said. "Don't you realize I have power either to free you or to crucify you?" Pilate was losing his grip. He was losing his grip on the moment. He was losing his grip on the power that he had. And so he tried to threaten Jesus with the supposed power that he had. "I have the power to free you and the power to crucify you." How does Jesus respond? "You would have no power over me unless it was given to you from above." In other words, these events are happening because God is allowing it to happen. But also, Pilate, you have been placed in a position of power by someone else. The power that you wield is being given to you as a gift. How you wield that power, Pilate, is now your choice to make. This is where Pilate, then we come back to Matthew 27, where Pilate now gets desperate and he tries to get Jesus off the hook. But by now, the moment has passed. Pilate had painted himself into a corner. You know the expression, when you paint someone, you're painting the floor of a room and you forget that you should have painted towards the door and you find yourself in the corner and you've got nowhere to go. Pilate had painted himself into a corner by giving into the crowd time and time again for what they wanted. It had happened 4 years earlier when he first arrived on scene, and he backed down then. And he was backing down now because he was a crowd pleaser. The Jews then played their trump card. Back in John 19, the Jews then played their trump card. From then on, Pilate tried to set Jesus free, but the Jews kept shouting, "If you let this man go, you are no friend of Caesar. Anyone who claims to be a king opposes Caesar." This was their trump card because they knew that if he didn't give in to what they wanted, they would report him to the imperial court back in Rome and say, "We had a man here who claimed to be a Messiah, a king who wanted to take over our country, and your governor couldn't even stand up to him." That was their trump card. And at this, Pilate buckled. He brings Jesus out and says, "Here is your king." Well, he's standing. We read in verse 13, Pilate, when he had heard this, he brought Jesus out and sat down on the judge's seat at a place known as the stone pavement, which in Aramaic is called Gabbatha. It was the preparation day of the Passover week, about the 6th hour. It was now about midday on Friday. Jesus was standing before Pilate at the place known as the stone pavement. Jesus was standing before the representative of the highest authority on this earth. Who was the power behind the Roman Empire? Satan himself. Satan himself. He was standing at the court of the prince of this world on his stone pavement. Where had Satan stood in heaven? before he was cast out. Ezekiel chapter 28 verse 14 tells us that he stood amongst the fiery stones. He had been judged in the courts of heaven on those fiery stones. And now Jesus stood before the representative of Satan himself, the ruler of this world, on his stone pavement. "Here is your king," Pilate said to the Jews. They shouted, take him away, crucify him." "Shall I crucify your king?" said Pilate. "We have no king but Caesar." What had the Jewish nation just done? They had capitulated. They had transferred their allegiance from the God of heaven to the ruler of the kingdom of the prince of this world. "We have no king but Caesar." Pilate then washes his hands. We're back in Matthew 27. He washes his hands. We should go there. Because he thinks that by just that act alone, he can declare himself innocent of the matter. If I just wash my hands of this, and that has been a saying that has come into the English language ever since. We want to have something we don't have anything to do with, we say, "I've washed my hands of that issue." He thought that the simple act of washing his hands would remove the stain of blood that would be forever on his hands. And the people shouted back to him, "Let his blood be on us and on our children." And we could say this morning that is a curse upon the Jewish nation. Let his blood, that responsibility for his blood be on us. But it's actually a prophetic statement, because unless his blood is on any of us, none of us could stand before the throne of God. It's quite a unique statement, really. Let his blood be on us. His blood has to be on us. If his blood is not on us, we cannot be a part of his kingdom. I want to take you to Isaiah 53. Isaiah 53. A well-known passage to all of you, I'm sure, but worth hearing these words again. Isaiah 53 and verse 7. "He was oppressed and afflicted, yet he did not open his mouth. He was led like a lamb to the slaughter. As a sheep before her shearers is silent, so he did not open his mouth. By oppression and judgment he was taken away, and who can speak of his descendants? He was cut off from the land of the living for the transgression of my people. He was stricken. He was assigned a grave of the wicked, and with the rich in his death. Though he had done no violence, nor was there any deceit in his mouth. Yet it was the Lord's will to crush him and cause him to suffer. And though the Lord makes his life a guilt offering, he will see his offspring and prolong his days. And the will of the Lord will prosper in his hand. And after the suffering of his soul, he will see the light of life and be satisfied." These words could be spoken of no one else but Jesus. The events that day were a fulfillment of prophecy. Pilate then handed him over and he released Barabbas. Pilate found himself in the perfect storm that placed him right at the centre that day. Jesus had said to his disciples, "I'm going up to Jerusalem, and there I'll be handed over to the Gentiles and mocked and flogged and crucified." Pilate found himself right at the heart of the fulfillment of that very prophecy that had said that the Messiah would come and give his life for you and I. But that doesn't mean that Pilate was some pawn in the process. He still had a choice to make. He still could have chosen to stand up for the right that day. I'm sure that Jesus would still have been crucified on that day, but Pilate himself would have been excused from having any guilt associated with that had he stood up for that man's innocence. Barabbas was released. Again, another huge miscarriage of justice. a man who was a murderer, had someone take his place. And you and I, all of us, are sons and daughters of the Father. We mightn't like to admit it, but unless Jesus takes our place, our fate would be the same as that of Barabbas, had Jesus not set him free that day. Pilate disappears. There's a couple of brief mentions later on in the day about Pilate hearing that Jesus had already died, and then on the Sabbath morning, the Jewish leaders come to him and ask him to seal up the tomb. He says, take a guard. And that's the last time we hear of Pilate in the biblical historical. He disappears from the Bible history. We do know from Josephus that in AD 36, Pilate slaughtered a group of Samaritans, brutally slaughtered them, considered what they were doing as an uprising against his authority. He slaughtered them. News of that got back to the imperial court in Rome. Pilate was summoned back to answer for the charges of murdering innocent people by Tiberius Caesar. On the way, Tiberius actually died. So by the time he got there, Caligula had taken over as emperor of Rome. We don't know what happened to Pilate after that, whether he was ever called for judgment against what he had done to the Samaritans. Later historians, though, give us a bit of a glimpse that he either took his life fairly close after the events of arriving back in Rome, somewhere around AD 37. Some suggest he may have taken his life as late as AD 41. But whatever happened to him, his life was never the same again from that encounter that he had with Jesus. And we could say that was a bit unfair to put a bloke in that position. How would any of us have coped in that situation? And of course, we have to acknowledge that the moment you are in a great position, you have a greater position of authority, what comes with that is a greater sense of responsibility. The greater your position, the higher the sense of responsibility that comes with that. Yes, that Friday was definitely Pilate's longest day. Dragged out of bed early in the morning, confronted with an issue that he wished would go away. And still by the end of the day, he was having to deal with it because he found out when people come and asked for Jesus' body back off the cross. It was definitely Pilate's longest day. But he had an opportunity then to go against popular opinion and the pressure of the public that were before him that day. He had a choice to make to go against the flow, or he could compromise for political expediency, which is what he did. He thought that in saving his own skin, he was afraid that the story would get back that he couldn't handle his job. And so he capitulated to the crowd and allowed them to have their way. He thought he was saving his skin, but it didn't work. When I think about compromise and expediency, I'm reminded of the words of a famous Christian author who said this: "The greatest want of this world is the want of men who will not be bought or sold. Men who will stand as true to principle as the needle to the pole. Men who would do the right though the heavens fall." Do you know any men like that? Do you know any politicians like that? I don't. I don't see anybody in the world like that. But it's the greatest want of our world today. And when I think about this story, I think about the Pilate that's in all of us. I want to bring this home now. I think about the Pilate that is in me, the coward that is in me. Because I'm a broken person and I live in a broken world. And I will always look out for my own needs. It's our human nature. We are so egocentric. We will always try and preserve our own backsides and our own skin. Do I have the courage to go against the flow? Do I have the courage to stand up for the right? And if I'm honest with myself, I realise that I am indeed a weak and vacillating man. How the world needs men who will stand for the right, though the heavens fall. Pilate's encounter with Jesus, we could say, was all but brief, but it was a very intense encounter, and he had a choice to make that day. You and I have a choice to make in our lives today as well. Your encounter with Jesus may only be brief in your lifetime as well. Or it may happen over a long period of time. But at some time in your life, you're going to have to make a decision for Jesus or against him. And you're going to ask him to be Lord of your life. Are you going to ask him and his blood to cover your life? Because until you do, like Pilate, you're going to be there against the forces of this world. They're going to want to push you in only one direction. Is there a message for the Advent people out of this story? As I read the book of Revelation, the book of last things, as I read the book of Revelation, the last book of the Bible, it tells us that at the end of time, the whole world, not just North America, not just South Africa, not just England, the whole world is going to be following the beast, whoever the beast may be. We can identify that person or that organisation at another time. The whole world is going to be forced into worshipping someone other than God. Have you and I got the fortitude as Advent people to stand up and go against the flow? When the whole world is deriding you for your faith in Christ, have you got the fortitude to stand up? I would want to suggest to you this morning that unless your life is covered with the blood of Christ, you won't have the strength to stand. Next week, I want to conclude our series on encounters with Jesus with a look at the thief on the cross, another person who encountered Jesus that day, and a totally different story again. And I pray that you will be here next week to hear that good story of an encounter with Jesus. May God bless you all. Thank you.
If we could all stand and sing together, Live Out Thy Life Within Me. Thy Shekinah glory now shine forth from within, and all the earth keeps silent, the body henceforth be thy silent, gentle servant, moved only as by thee. Its members every moment held subject to thy call, ready to have thee stress or fret, or chafings at thy dealings, or thoughts of vain regret. Restful, calm, and pliant, from bend and bias free, awaiting thy decision when thou hast need of me. Live out thy life within me, O Jesus, King of kings. Be thou the glorious answer to all my questionings.
Shall we pray? Jesus, indeed, be the glorious answer to all our questionings. Lord, be the answer to all of our hopes and all of our dreams. And may you indeed come one day soon. Lord, help us to be ready to stand on that day. Help us to be faithful to you. May we choose you this day and this day forward always, we pray in your name.